Hello friends! In today's video, we are going to talk about a complex and very unique situation, and that is divorcing a spouse who's in prison. Yikes! If you are considering taking this step, I will walk you through the key differences, legal considerations, and some of the things that you might expect during this process of divorcing a spouse who's in prison. So stay tuned for all of this information. Welcome back to the Divorce Broadcast. My name is Manny Segarra, coming to you from Miami, Florida. Alright, so as I mentioned in the intro, we are going to address a very sensitive and delicate topic today, dealing with a divorce when one of the spouses is in prison. But before we get started, I must say that there is no judgment here. For the grace of God, any of us can be in prison. And for the person who has a spouse in prison, a lot of times this topic is often taboo or off limits. It is very difficult or uncomfortable for them to bring the topic of either their spouse being in prison or actually divorcing that spouse up to their family, their friends, their work colleagues, or acquaintances. So we are happy to be the go-to spot to give information about the issues that come up when divorcing a spouse who's in prison. One of the very first questions that arise when dealing with a spouse who is in prison is the question of jurisdiction. Where is the divorce going to be filed? Now, every state and every jurisdiction is different, so it is imperative to check your local statutes, maybe do some online research, or speak with a family law attorney to determine where the jurisdiction lies when one of the spouses is in prison. Typically, the jurisdiction would lie where the spouse who is not in prison resides, or where the spouse who is currently in prison is sentenced and located. By way of example, if a spouse lives in Miami-Dade County and the spouse who's incarcerated is up north in Tallahassee in Leon County, then here in Florida, either jurisdiction, whether it be Miami-Dade County or Leon County, would have possible jurisdiction over the divorce. But again, check the local statute to see where jurisdiction lies in cases involving spouses who are currently in prison. The next issue that oftentimes comes up when dealing with a spouse who is in prison is how to effectuate service of process. Remember that the spouse who files for divorce against the other spouse who's in prison knows where he or she is located. They're currently serving a sentence in a correctional facility. Therefore, the divorce paperwork usually has to be served on that spouse. So what are you supposed to do? A lot of people scratch their head and think to themselves, well, how am I going to get the divorce paperwork over there? Thankfully, a lot of these correctional facilities have processes and procedures on how to get the inmates legal paperwork. So a good first step is to call the correctional facility and see what their process and procedure is in terms of legal paperwork and serving legal paperwork on their inmates. Also, the process serving companies, a lot of process servers, they deal with this issue quite often. If you call them, they may know what the process is in terms of effectuating service. But it is crucial to make sure that if the whereabouts of the spouse that is the respondent, the spouse who is getting the divorce paperwork filed against them, is known, that the service of process procedure is followed carefully in order to avoid any unnecessary delays. Once the service is effectuated on the spouse who's in jail, a court may or may not require that spouse to go to the different court proceedings, because remember, the spouse is currently in custody, so they may have a little bit more difficult time getting to and from court. So the court may allow them to appear by video or may enter an order requiring the Department of Corrections of that particular county to transport the inmate or the spouse who's in prison to court for court proceedings. In the event the court may waive some appearances, it doesn't mean that they're going to waive all of the appearances. So it is important to recognize that each case is different and each particular hearing may be different as well. As a practice tip, it is very important to consider when the spouse who's in prison must come to court proceedings, and the use of ex parte orders, meaning orders that are submitted to the court separately without a court hearing, can in some jurisdictions be used in order to transport the inmate for court proceedings. Or if the inmate needs to be transported for mediation, perhaps Perhaps an ex parte order to transport to the Department of Corrections that's holding on to the inmate or has possession of the inmate can be issued so that they will transport the inmate for mediation. A lot of times an ex parte order for remote appearance, that as long as the Zoom address of the mediation conference appears on that order, may be executed. And what is also extremely important is that when there is a final hearing or some evidentiary hearing in which the inmate, the spouse who is currently in prison, must appear, it is very important to think ahead and figure out how that spouse is going to be transported. One of the big and important topics is what will a court do when addressing children's issues, whether it be the time sharing schedule, parental responsibility, and things of that nature. It is abundantly clear that courts will always prioritize the best interest of the children. So the court will try to figure out if the best interests of the children are suited by allowing contact between the spouse who's in prison and the children. A lot of times it won't happen given the nature of the charges, or it might. The courts may consider allowing for there to be video time sharing or supervised time sharing. Each case is different, but the courts will almost always guide themselves by the best interests of the children. In reality, though, while that other parent is serving their sentence, the spouse who is on the outside, who is not currently incarcerated, may consider asking the court to give them temporary sole parental responsibility so that they can make the decisions, at least on a temporary basis, that are important regarding the children's schooling or medical decisions, or if there's any emergencies. A lot of times, if a parent or spouse is in prison, they won't be able to make these decisions, both logistically and maybe because it may not be in the best interest of the children. We must also realize that the courts automatically won't divest or not allow for a spouse who's in prison to see the children. It is going to be case specific. The one thing, though, that will probably be pretty certain is if the spouse is in prison for committing a crime either against the other spouse or the children of the marriage, then more likely than not there will either be a criminal stay away order or some order in effect that prohibits contact between that spouse in prison and the children or the other spouse. Now we're going to talk about one of the more controversial parts of a spouse being in prison, and that is the fact that simply because a spouse is in prison, that doesn't automatically negate their ability to be entitled to equitable distribution or distribution of the property of the marital estate. I tell people this all the time, and they are oftentimes shocked. So each jurisdiction is different, but simply because a spouse is currently facing a prison sentence doesn't mean that they won't be entitled to some of the assets or investments or some of the property located or that have been obtained during the course of the marriage, and the debts as well. So it is important to look closely at the assets and liabilities, and it is also important to consider speaking with an attorney to try to see if there's other filings or other motions that can be filed perhaps in civil court to try to diminish the amount of the assets or the marital estate that the spouse in prison will be receiving. These are very important considerations. When dealing with the issues of alimony and child support, the prospects of getting that number to be high or significant are usually pretty low. And that is because the spouse serving prison time usually doesn't have a job because they're in prison, and their income will be imputed at minimum wage or sometimes even less. So the prospects of them paying alimony or child support will be significantly impacted by the fact that they are in prison. This doesn't mean that the court will not award lump sum alimony or nominal alimony or some different alimony to the spouse who is not in prison. Maybe they'll make a future determination of alimony. Child support can always be modified depending upon if there's a substantial change in the incomes of the parties. But when it comes to the finances, usually the spouse who is in prison makes significantly less. And then when they get out of prison, their job prospects are probably diminished as well. So this area is definitely impacted by a spouse who's in prison. Now, before we sign off on today's video, dealing with a spouse who's in prison, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the emotional toll that this may have on the spouse who's not in prison, who is seeking a divorce from that spouse who is currently in prison. Obviously, they may go through a whole gamut of different emotions, including guilt or depression or sadness. This is definitely a tense situation, so it is definitely a suggestion to seek therapy or counseling or support from your circle of friends and family. Seeking support through these mechanisms will definitely help out with this process and allow that spouse to move on with the rest of their lives. Remember that dealing with a divorce involving a spouse who's currently in prison has its own very unique challenges. As we mentioned during this video, there are some jurisdictional and procedural issues. There are also issues of equitable distribution or distribution of property that may not be as affected. There are also children's issues. And we also discussed how the income of that spouse who is in prison or serving a prison term is going to be affected, and therefore it will affect alimony and child support. So if any of you know anybody that might find this information useful, have them look us up at www.segarralawfirm.com. We have offices in Miami and Orlando, Florida. Se habla español. Do us a favor and like this video. Subscribe to the Divorce Broadcast, and we will speak to you all soon. Thank you.